Two men sat courtside in San Antonio on the night of April 19, 2026. They did not have to be there. They had no obligations, no contracts, no professional reason to show up at Frost Bank Center for a first-round playoff game against the Portland Trail Blazers. They came because they wanted to. Because something was happening in their building, the building their championship banners hang in, the building their legacy was constructed inside, the building that once bore witness to 5 NBA titles, and they needed to see it with their own eyes. David Robinson, Tim Duncan, the Admiral and the Big Fundamental, the two greatest players in San Antonio Spurs history, side by side in the stands, watching a 22-year-old Frenchman do something that nobody in that arena had ever seen before. Victor Wembanyama scored 35 points in his postseason debut. He shot 13 of 21 from the field. He hit 5 three-pointers. He controlled both ends of the floor with an authority that made Portland look like they had never prepared for him at all. He broke a franchise record that Tim Duncan had held for 28 years, the highest-scoring playoff debut in Spurs history, and he did it while Duncan was sitting in the building watching. After the game, a reporter asked Wembanyama what it meant to have Robinson and Duncan there, to have the legends of the franchise present for his first-ever playoff game. And Wembanyama said something that stopped the room. He said he would not call it wait. He said he felt safe, that it felt like if you trip, you know there are a lot of hands ready to catch you. Safe, with Tim Duncan in the building. That word, and the relationship it hints at, is the key to understanding a story that the basketball world has been watching unfold in real time for 3 years. A story about what Tim Duncan saw when he first laid eyes on Victor Wembanyama, about what he knew before anyone else was willing to say it, about a legacy that was passed not through friendship or mentorship in the conventional sense, but through something more fundamental, through the recognition of one generational player seeing another, and about what happened when that generational player lost his first NBA Finals, and what Duncan's story tells us about what comes next. Let's go all the way back to where this comparison was first born. It was not born in San Antonio. It was not born in any NBA arena. It was born in France, in the gymnasium of Metropolitans 92, a team so far removed from European basketball's elite that its games would ordinarily have been invisible to the international basketball world. But in 2022, those games were being broadcast globally on NBA League Pass, not because of the team, because of the 18-year-old playing for it. Victor Wembanyama, 7 feet 4 inches tall, a wingspan that stretched past 8 feet, the ability to handle the basketball like a point guard, shoot from anywhere on the floor, and defend in ways that the foreign sport had simply never produced at any position. Scouts who had spent decades evaluating talent watched those games and ran out of language to describe what they were seeing. The comparisons they reached for were not other current players. They were not recent draft picks or young stars in development. The comparisons they reached for were from history, from the permanent record of the greatest players who ever lived, and the comparison that kept coming back, from the most serious evaluators in the sport, was Tim Duncan. Not because of the style, not because of the footwork or the bank shot or the quiet leadership that Duncan became famous for, but because of the category, the once-in-a-generation dominance on both ends of the floor simultaneously, the ability to walk into a professional environment and immediately be better than almost everyone in it. The presence of a player who does not merely compete at the highest level, but redefines what competing at the highest level looks like. Duncan had done it in 1997. He walked into the NBA as the first overall pick, joined a San Antonio team that had David Robinson at his disposal, and within 2 seasons had led the Spurs to a championship. He won Finals MVP. He was 22 years old, and the basketball world understood almost immediately that it was watching something that did not come along very often. 26 years later, the Spurs stood at the draft podium and called Wembanyama's name, and Tim Duncan, who had spent his post-playing career largely out of the spotlight, quiet, private, consistent with the personality that had defined his entire career, said something that not enough people paid attention to at the time. He said Wembanyama was going to be special, not good, not promising, special. In a league that produces exceptional talent every year, Duncan used the word that separates the exceptional from the permanent. He said he saw something in the kid that reminded him of what it felt like to know, from the beginning, that the game was going to bend to the player rather than the other way around. Tim Duncan was 50 years old when he said that. He had seen everything the sport produced for 3 decades. He had won 5 championships and 2 MVPs and been the anchor of one of the most sustained dynasties in professional sports history. His opinion was not the opinion of a casual observer. It was the opinion of the only person in that conversation who had actually lived through being the generational talent that everyone else was measuring Wembanyama against. And he said Wembanyama was going to be special. Now let's look at what the first 3 years actually produced. Because the data, the cold, statistical, undeniable record of what Wembanyama has done since the night his name was called, is the most powerful argument for everything Duncan said. His debut season produced numbers that had never been produced by a player his age in NBA history. His sophomore campaign, before it was cut short by deep vein thrombosis in his shoulder, saw him average 24.3 points, 11 rebounds, 3.7 assists, 1.1 steals, and 3.8 blocks per game, on 47.6% shooting. Those are not rookie numbers padded by a friendly schedule. Those are elite, established, all-NBA numbers from a player in his second year. In his third season, the one that just ended, he became the first unanimous Defensive Player of the Year winner in NBA history. Not the youngest. First in a certain time frame. The first unanimous. Every single vote, from every voter who submitted a ballot. The best defensive player in the sport, at 22 years old. The statistical parallels between his 2026 playoff run and Duncan's 1999 championship run are not approximate. They are almost identical. Duncan in the 1999 playoffs, 23.2 points, 11.5 rebounds, 2.8 assists, 2.6 blocks per game, 51.1% from the field. Wembanyama in the 2026 playoffs through the Western Conference Finals, 23.2 points, 10.8 rebounds, 2.7 assists, 3.5 blocks per game, 51% from the field, 37% from three. The same numbers, from two different players, 27 years apart, both wearing Spurs uniforms, both 22 years old, both carrying San Antonio through the same playoff opponents. Portland eliminated in the first round, Minnesota eliminated in the second round, before facing a climactic Western Conference showdown that determined who would stand in the finals. Duncan beat the Lakers and the Trail Blazers in the West to reach the 1999 finals against the Knicks. Wembanyama beat the Timberwolves and the Thunder, the defending champions. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's team, eliminated in 7 grueling games, to reach the 2026 finals against the Knicks. The same franchise, the same matchup. 27 years later, Duncan won in 1999 in 5 games, averaging 27.4 points and 14 rebounds with Finals MVP honors, delivering San Antonio its first championship in franchise history. When Duncan stood on that court with the trophy, the basketball world understood it was not witnessing a single event, it was witnessing the beginning of a dynasty. Wembanyama did not win. And that is the part of the story that Duncan's career actually illuminates most clearly. Not the parallel that was fulfilled, but the one that was not. Because here is what the basketball world knows about Tim Duncan, that it sometimes forgets when using him as a measuring stick. He did not win his first finals simply because he showed up. He won because he was 22 years old, and already more complete, more polished, more fundamentally certain of what he was doing on a basketball court than almost any player in the league. Sean Elliott, who played alongside him in those early years, said publicly in June 2026 that Duncan at 22 was a completely different player from Wembanyama at 22. That Duncan was already extremely polished, fundamentally sound, and pretty much there. That Wembanyama, by comparison, is still barely scratching the surface. That Elliott does not think Wembanyama has even begun to reach his true potential. That is not a criticism, that is a roadmap. Because what Elliott is saying, what the comparison between where Duncan was at 22 and where Wembanyama is at 22 actually reveals, is not that Wembanyama fell short of the standard. It is that the standard he will eventually reach may be even higher than what Duncan achieved, precisely because he is starting from a different place. Duncan arrived in the league already refined. Wembanyama arrived in the league already extraordinary, but still unfinished. And an unfinished Wembanyama already produces numbers that mirror the greatest finals performance by a Duncan-era Spur. An unfinished Wembanyama already became the first unanimous DPOY in NBA history. What does a finished Wembanyama look like? That question is what makes the finals loss not a defeat of his legacy, but the first chapter of it. Kevin Garnett appeared on his podcast after the 2026 finals and revealed something that adds another layer to this story entirely. He said that Wembanyama had tapped into the wisdom of Hakeem Olajuwon, that he had trained with Hakeem in the offseason, working on the footwork and the post moves and the feel for the game that the Dream was famous for, systematizing and teaching. He said Wembanyama had also spent time with Garnett himself. And then he said something else, something about Tim Duncan specifically. He said the relationship between Wembanyama and Duncan had not been consummated. His exact word, not consummated. That from what he was hearing, the connection between the greatest Spur who ever played and the young man now carrying that franchise had not fully developed into the mentorship that the situation seemed to call for. That it was not fluid. That is the most interesting piece of information in this entire story. Because Tim Duncan sitting courtside and watching Wembanyama break his 28-year record, and feeling whatever he felt in that moment, is one thing. But the transfer of knowledge, the real, specific, hard-won understanding of what it takes to win in the NBA Finals and sustain excellence across not one season but many, that transfer has apparently not happened yet. And Wembanyama's finals performance, in retrospect, tells you exactly where the gap is. He shot 42.3% from the field in the series against the Knicks. He attempted 33 three-pointers in 5 games, the third most in the series, more than most perimeter players, and converted them at 27.3%. In a 5-game series against a Jalen Brunson-led team that exposed his ball handling under pressure and found ways to make him inefficient at the exact moments the Spurs needed him to be lethal, Wembanyama was not the player who had averaged 23.2 points at 51% efficiency throughout the earlier rounds. Duncan in the 1999 Finals averaged 27.4 points on 50% shooting. In the biggest moment, he got better. He simplified his game, operated closer to the basket, forced the Knicks to make decisions they did not want to make, and delivered results that were more dominant than anything he had produced in the earlier rounds. That is the lesson Wembanyama has not yet learned. Not because he lacks the talent to learn it, but because learning it requires exactly the kind of experience that only losing a finals can provide. Wembanyama said after the series that he was going to hold everything inside of him and execute for 100 games, that it was going to be 100 games before the Spurs could get back, and he was going to carry that weight every one of them. Tim Duncan never said things like that publicly. He did not perform his competitive fire in press conferences. He showed it in October, in November, in January, in every practice and every game across a 21-year career that produced 5 championships and never a single season in which the Spurs were irrelevant. The fire was real. It was just quiet. Wembanyama is different from Duncan in personality. He is louder, more expressive, more willing to let the basketball world see what he is feeling. That is not a weakness. It is simply a different kind of greatness. But the lesson Duncan's career teaches, the one that is most relevant to where Wembanyama stands right now, in July 2026, after his first finals loss, is this. The great ones do not respond to failure by telling the world what they are going to do. They respond by disappearing into the work and returning in October, having become something the team that beat them did not account for. Duncan lost in the first round in 1998 to the Jazz. He came back in 1999 and won the championship. He lost in the second round in 2000 to the Lakers. He came back in 2001, 2002, 2003, and won the championship. He lost in the first round in 2004 to the Lakers. He came back in 2005 and won the championship again. Every time the sport asked him a question he could not immediately answer, he came back with a response that made the question look small. That is what Tim Duncan was right about. Not just that Wembanyama would be special in his first 3 years. Anyone who watched him play for Metropolitans '92 could see that. What Duncan understood, sitting in that arena watching a 22-year-old break his record and say he felt safe, was something deeper. He understood that the player in front of him had the rarest ingredient. Not the talent, not the athleticism, not the basketball IQ. All of those were visible to everyone. What Duncan recognized was the competitive DNA, the thing that does not show up in scouting reports or statistical projections, the thing that only reveals itself in moments of maximum pressure, in finals games that are slipping away, in tunnels walked alone after championship losses, in off-seasons spent working instead of recovering. That DNA, that specific, irreplaceable thing. Duncan saw it in Wembanyama before anyone else had proof of it, because Duncan has it himself, and people with it can recognize it in others long before the world catches up. The relationship between them has not been consummated, Garnett said. Not fluid. But here is what the 2026 summer has set up. Here is what the next chapter of this story actually looks like. Wembanyama is 22 years old. He just lost a finals in 5 games. He has spent the offseason training with Hakeem Olajuwon on the post moves that would make him more dangerous in the paint and less dependent on the three-point line that failed him in the biggest moments of the series. He told the world he is going to hold that loss inside of him for 100 games. And Tim Duncan, 5 championships, 2 MVPs, the greatest Spur who ever played, is still in San Antonio, still courtside, still watching, still with hands ready to catch someone if they trip. The question is not whether Wembanyama will come back better. Given everything the data shows about his trajectory, given the competitive DNA that Duncan recognized before anyone else, given the specific, identifiable weaknesses that the Knicks exposed in the finals, the overdependence on the three-point line, the decision-making under pressure in the fourth quarter, the tendency to reach for hero moments when fundamental dominance would be more effective, the path forward is not mysterious. It is the same path Tim Duncan walked. Get closer to the basket in the big moments. Trust the fundamentals when the pressure is highest. Do not try to win with your range when you can win with your presence. Let the size and the intelligence and the defensive gravity do the work that no jump shot can replicate. Duncan knew that from year 2. Wembanyama is learning it after year 3. The difference between them at 22 is real, and it is documented. Duncan was more polished. Duncan was more ready. Duncan walked into his first finals and dominated. But the difference between them at 30 might be something else entirely. Because Wembanyama at 22, unfinished, still learning, having just lost a championship he expected to win, is already producing numbers that mirror Duncan at 22. And what Sean Elliott said, that Wembanyama has not yet begun to reach his true potential, is either the most alarming statement in the NBA or the most exciting one, depending entirely on which jersey you are rooting for. Tim Duncan was right about Victor Wembanyama all along. Not because Wembanyama won a championship at 22, he did not. Duncan did, and that distinction is real. But because Duncan looked at a 7'4" Frenchman breaking records in a French gymnasium and recognized something that the rest of the basketball world had to watch 3 years of playoff basketball to confirm. He recognized a player whose ceiling was not determined by what he could do right now. He recognized a player whose ceiling was determined by what he was willing to do about the losses. And if the 100 games Wembanyama promised to carry that finals loss through look anything like the seasons Duncan put together after his own early playoff eliminations, then the Knicks did not just beat the Spurs in the 2026 finals, they woke something up. And the NBA is not ready for what comes next.